Night of June 5th, 1944. The English Channel lies restless beneath a bruised sky, trembling with the weight of a coming storm. The sea heaves and churns, black as oil, while waves crash against the anchored hulls of thousands of Allied ships lined along England's southern coast. Rain pelts the decks like a barrage of bullets, drumming on steel and echoing through the dark like distant artillery. Inside one of those vessels, a squat control ship rocking in the gale, the air smells of diesel, sweat, and damp paper. In a cramped cabin, under the unsteady glow of flickering lamps, a handful of engineers huddle around a massive map spread across a table scarred by compass marks and coffee stains. Their shadows waver on the walls as lightning flashes through the porthole. "Gentlemen," begins Brigadier Bruce White of the Royal Engineers, his voice steady despite the thunder overhead. "If we fail, the invasion fails with us. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Every man in the room knows what he means. Outside, across the dark expanse of the Channel, the greatest amphibious force ever assembled is preparing to move. In less than 24 hours, more than 150,000 soldiers will storm the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, the boldest gamble of the war. Yet beneath the glory and grandeur of the plan lies a question so dire that it threatens to undo the entire invasion before it even begins. "How," says one of the younger engineers, his voice low, "will we keep them supplied once they're ashore? The silence that follows is heavier than the rain." Everyone knows the answer, or rather, the lack of one. Without harbours, the invasion force will starve. Tanks need fuel. Guns need shells. Men need food, water, and medicine. Every drop and every bullet must cross that turbulent stretch of sea. But the ports of France are either destroyed by German demolition teams or bristling with enemy defences. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Calais, all are either fortified or too far from the chosen beaches. The Germans believe they have outguessed the Allies. No sane commander, they reason, would land an army where no deep-water port exists. That assumption, Bruce White thinks grimly, may become their undoing. He steps forward, rolling up his sleeves. The room smells faintly of wet wool and tobacco. He takes a pencil and draws a long, deliberate line across the map from Portsmouth to a small French town named Arromanches. "This," he says quietly, "is where Britain will build the road to victory." The men exchange uncertain looks. Build a harbour? Out of what? How? The seafloor near Normandy offers no shelter, no docks, no piers, just shifting sand and shallow tides. But Bruce White's eyes gleam with an engineer's stubborn faith. He has spent months sketching, testing, and dreaming of something so audacious it sounds like madness. Floating harbours, vast and modular, that can be assembled at sea and anchored off the beaches like artificial cities. "Imagine," he continues, "giant breakwaters made of concrete caissons, each as large as a cathedral to calm the surf. Then floating piers, pontoons, and steel roadways connecting to the shore. Ships will unload directly onto these platforms. Trucks and tanks will roll across them straight into France." One of the officers scoffs. "That's impossible. The tides alone would tear it apart." Bruce White smiles faintly. "Then we will design it to bend, not break." The wind howls outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn moans a lonely sound swallowed by the storm. The engineers lean closer to the map as Bruce explains the plan's code name, Mulberry. 2 harbours will be built, Mulberry A for the Americans at Omaha Beach, and Mulberry B for the British at Gold Beach near Arromanches. Each will be capable of unloading 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. It is a figure so large that it feels abstract until one imagines the weight, the steel, the fuel, the food for men who will fight and bleed on French soil. To make it possible, thousands of workers across Britain have been labouring in secret shipyards, dry docks, and estuaries. They pour concrete day and night, casting enormous caissons nicknamed phoenixes. They weld floating roadways called whales, and steel piers mounted on adjustable legs known as spuds. Everything must fit together perfectly, every bolt, every hinge, every chain. Once complete, these colossal pieces will be towed across the channel like a caravan of leviathans and assembled under enemy fire. "Gentlemen," Bruce White says, pointing to the sketches, "this harbour will not be built in safety. It will be built in the surf, in the chaos of battle. Every wave, every gust of wind will test it." The youngest engineer, a lad barely in his 20s, whispers, "And if it fails?" Bruce pauses. "Then every man who lands tomorrow may die on that beach." A long silence falls. The only sound is the storm hammering the hull. But even in the storm's fury, there is resolve. These men, quiet, methodical, unsung, understand the stakes. Their tools are not rifles or bayonets, but slide rules, pencils, and the stubborn courage of invention. They will fight their war not with bullets, but with geometry and steel. Outside, lightning splits the sky again, illuminating the vast silhouettes of ships stretching toward the horizon. Landing craft bob in the waves like toy boats. Somewhere in the darkness, soldiers wait seasick, silent, clutching photographs of home. They do not know of Mulberry, nor the men designing it tonight, but their lives depend on it. Bruce stares out the rain-slick porthole. The channel is wild, the wind fierce yet, in his mind, he already sees the harbour complete. He imagines the Phoenix caissons sunk into place, forming breakwaters half a mile long. He sees floating piers rising and falling with the tide, trucks rumbling over them as cranes swing crates of ammunition overhead. He sees victory fragile, improvised, but real. Behind him, an engineer mutters, "We'll never have time to test it properly." "We'll test it in Normandy," Bruce replies. At that, a chuckle ripples through the group, not of amusement, but of grim acceptance. This is the engineer's battlefield. Failure is not an option. The wind shifts, the lamps flicker again. A signalman bursts through the door, soaked to the bone. "Sir, the weather's worsening. General Eisenhower's postponed the invasion by 24 hours. Bruce nods slowly. "Then we have one more night to prepare." When the others leave, he lingers by the table. The storm outside has grown into a living thing, roaring against the hull. He touches the pencil line on the map one last time, tracing the thin bridge between two nations, between fear and faith. Somewhere out there, beyond the darkness, the road to Normandy waits to be built not from stone, but from ingenuity and will. As midnight strikes, Bruce White whispers to the empty cabin, "Tomorrow, the sea will be our scaffold, and from it, we'll build hope." Outside, the thunder answers him, rolling like distant artillery across the channel. The storm rages on the storm before the storm. The story begins 2 years earlier, August 1942. The place, Dieppe, on the northern coast of France. The event, a raid that would end in tragedy. Before dawn, Allied landing craft crept toward the shore in a rehearsal for the invasion to come. But within hours, the experiment dissolved into catastrophe. Hundreds of bodies lay broken on the sand, their uniforms soaked crimson. Tanks bogged down before even reaching the seawall, trapped by the tide and torn apart by artillery. Ships burned offshore, the sea itself catching fire. It was a bitter lesson paid in blood that to assault a defended port head-on was not bravery, but suicide. In the aftermath, the planners of what would become Operation Overlord faced a cruel paradox. They needed harbours to bring their armies into France to unload tanks, fuel, ammunition, and food. Yet they could not seize any harbour without first invading. It was a circle with no exit, an equation with no answer. The beaches of Normandy offered shallow tides, open water, and no shelter. The Germans, convinced no sane commander would land there, left them relatively undefended. But even if the Allies managed to reach those sands, how would they sustain an army once ashore? That was when Winston Churchill, restless as ever, scribbled a few words on a sheet of notepaper. It was not written on official stationery, nor drafted by a committee. Just one man, one pen, and one audacious thought. If we do not capture ports, we must build them, take the harbours with us. Those 12 words changed history. From that moment, the impossible became a blueprint. The idea was breathtaking in its simplicity and staggering in its ambition. To design, construct, and deploy entire harbours that could float across the English Channel, vast, modular, and strong enough to withstand the fiercest tides in Europe. 2 would be made, each with its own code name. Mulberry A for the Americans at Omaha Beach, Mulberry B for the British and Canadians at Gold Beach. Together, they would be the arteries through which the lifeblood of the invasion would flow. The scale of the project defied comprehension. 400 separate components totaling more than 1.5 million tons of concrete, steel, and timber would be fabricated in secrecy across Britain. Every single piece had to float. The harbours would stretch for miles, containing everything from breakwaters and piers to floating roads and cranes. It was an entire industrial port except that it would move. Construction began under armed guard in secret shipyards along the English coast, Lepe, Southampton, Portsmouth, Tilbury, and beyond. Entire beaches were fenced off, and the curious were turned away at gunpoint. To most of the workers, the purpose of their labour remained a mystery. They only knew that they were building something enormous, and that the war itself seemed to depend on it. To an outsider, the work looked like madness. Giant concrete boxes as tall as houses, resting like stranded whales on the sand. Steel bridges longer than football fields, gleaming in the sun. Floating piers designed to rise and fall with the tides. The sight was surreal, a fleet of strange mechanical beasts waiting for their moment to come alive. But to the engineers, each part had a name, a purpose, and a place in the grand design. The Phoenix caissons, hollow concrete monoliths that would be sunk to form breakwaters, taming the sea's fury. The whale roadways, flexible steel bridges that could stretch from ship to shore, rising and falling with the tide. The spud pierheads, adjustable docking platforms that stood on giant telescoping legs, allowing ships to unload no matter the water's depth. The bombardons, floating steel barriers, shaped like giant crosses, that would sit offshore to calm the waves before they reached the harbour wall. Each name sounded poetic, but each design was a triumph of logic. It was engineering poetry written in rivets and reinforced concrete. Nearly 1 million tons of materials, 20,000 men, and 5 months of relentless labour went into forging these strange, colossal jigsaw pieces. Every bolt, every weld, every measurement was tested in wave tanks and model basins. Engineers studied how tides would pull and twist the floating structures. They watched scale models shatter in artificial storms, then rebuilt them stronger. The goal was paradoxical: to create something rigid enough to endure the channel's violence, yet flexible enough to move with its rhythm. An American engineer, exhausted after weeks of sleepless nights, wrote in his diary, "It's like trying to build a cathedral that floats." And yet, somehow, it worked. In London, committees and code officers debated logistics, but in the shipyards, the work continued day and night. The clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches echoed over the coast. Women in overalls poured concrete into wooden moulds. Dockhands guided cranes to lift girders the size of railway cars. Truck convoys thundered through country lanes carrying steel beams disguised under tarpaulins. Each component was assigned a number, a destination, a sequence. When finished, they would be towed slowly, cautiously across the channel, assembled like toys on the waves, and anchored into position within days of the invasion. The logistics were staggering. Hundreds of tugboats, precise timing with the tides, and coordination on a scale that dwarfed anything attempted before. All of this unfolded in utter secrecy. Not even the workers fully understood the miracle they were shaping. Some joked that the government was preparing floating prisons, others guessed oil platforms or decoys. Only a handful of senior officers knew the truth, that these constructs would become the backbone of the greatest invasion in history. By the spring of 1944, the pieces began to gather in the Solent, that stretch of water between the Isle of Wight and the English mainland. From above, reconnaissance aircraft saw nothing unusual. Camouflage nets and false structures hid the truth. But beneath the green tarps and grey paint, two entire harbours waited like sleeping giants. The Phoenix caissons stood half-submerged, their massive forms tethered by chains. The whale roadways rested coiled like serpents on barges, ready to unfurl. The bombardons floated quietly, offshore, their metal hulls rocking gently in the tide. Every engineer who passed them felt a mix of awe and disbelief. To imagine that all of this vast man-made puzzle would soon cross the channel and function as one seamless machine seemed almost beyond reason. Then came the tests, storm simulations in Scotland, towing trials along the coast of Wales. Each time, the designs proved sound, the joints holding fast even under the fiercest gales. The sea, that ancient enemy, had been outwitted at least for now. And so, by June of 1944, two complete Mulberry harbours stood ready, hidden under tarpaulins, anchored in the shallows, awaiting their call to destiny. The men who had designed them, many of whom had lost brothers at Dieppe, now watched with quiet pride as the pieces assembled. They knew what was at stake. Without these floating harbours, the liberation of Europe could falter before it even began. Somewhere, in a small office near Portsmouth, a weary engineer set down his pencil and whispered to himself, "It's not a harbour, it's a promise." Outside, the wind carried the scent of salt and steel. The tide turned. The ships prepared to sail. The impossible blueprint born from failure, built in secrecy, and bound by hope was finally ready to meet the sea. June 6, 1944 D-Day. The dawn breaks not with light but with thunder. The beaches of Normandy erupt in fire and steel. The sky trembles under the weight of 1,000 bombers. The sea churns with landing craft, each one packed with men who have waited years for this single day. As the first ramps crash down, soldiers surge into the surf, rifles raised, hearts pounding. Gunfire tears through the mist. Mortars scream. Sand and blood mix beneath their boots. From dawn until dusk, the Allies fight inch by inch, storming the beaches, scaling the cliffs, and clawing their way through the German defences. By nightfall, the beachheads are secure, but only just. Thousands lie dead or wounded. The air smells of smoke and salt, the sound of battle still echoing across the surf. Offshore, the channel is a graveyard. Landing craft drift, riddled with holes. Oil slicks glisten on the waves. Bodies float among the wreckage, their helmets bobbing like dark buoys in the fading light. The invasion has succeeded, but only barely. The soldiers have won a foothold, yet that victory is as fragile as the sand beneath their feet. Without a harbour, without a steady flow of supplies, the men on those beaches are stranded between triumph and ruin. Ammunition will run out, fuel will vanish, food will spoil. The sea that carried them here could just as easily abandon them. On the afternoon of that same day, as the guns still thunder on shore, the order is given. Commence Operation Mulberry. Far to the north, in English ports from Chelsea to Southampton, an armada begins to stir. Tugboats, trawlers, and corvettes roar to life. Lines are cast. Chains tighten. From the shadows of the harbours emerge the monstrous shapes of the Mulberry components, the great floating pieces of the artificial ports. Each Phoenix caisson, 6,000 tons of hollow concrete, groans as it is refloated. They rise from the water like grey giants reborn. One by one, they are hitched behind fleets of tugs, forming convoys unlike anything the sea has ever witnessed. The journey is perilous. The channel is restless, the wind sharp. Waves slam against the concrete hulls, but the tugs press on, their engines straining. At night, the sea glows faintly with red and green navigation lamps, a floating city in motion. From a distance, it looks almost otherworldly, a constellation of lights gliding across the black water. British sailors steer carefully between the hulking silhouettes of the phoenixes, shouting through megaphones, "Easy does it, lads! That's Churchill's harbour you're towing!" Laughter cuts through the wind. For a moment, amid the chaos of war, there is pride in what human hands have made. A Royal Navy officer writes in his log that night, "It felt biblical, as if we were dragging mountains across the sea." 10 days later, the first Phoenix caissons reach the French coast near Arromanches. The storm still lashes the waves, but the work begins at once. Using dynamite and anchors, engineers sink the caissons in precise formation, creating a curved wall that stretches like a crescent around the bay. This will be Mulberry B, the British harbour soon to be nicknamed Port Winston. Piece by piece, the miracle takes shape. Offshore, Bombardon breakwaters form the first line of defence, absorbing the fury of the waves before they strike the coast. Behind them, the Phoenix blocks rise from the sea like a chain of fortresses, their concrete walls glistening in the rain. Inside the calm lagoon they create, floating piers and whale roadways unfurl like steel ribbons, linking Liberty ships anchored offshore directly to the sand. Within a week, the ocean has been transformed. What was once an empty stretch of surf is now a living, breathing port, a machine of motion and balance. The tide lifts and lowers its limbs like the chest of a sleeping giant. Trucks rumble down the floating bridges. Cranes swing over the waves, unloading crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. For the first time, the beaches of Normandy have a heartbeat. It is, as one engineer later called it, a miracle of steel and faith. The men who built it had done the impossible, conceived in secrecy, built in haste, delivered into the heart of war. Every bolt, every hinge, every weld forged in British shipyards now proves its worth beneath the guns of France. By June 15th, the first Liberty ship LST 543 edges toward Port Winston. She glides slowly into the calm waters behind the breakwaters and ties up against the floating pier. The men on deck cheer. Some wave their caps. A bugler, standing on the pier, lifts his instrument and plays a short, triumphant note that echoes over the bay. Then, with the sound of grinding gears, the ship's ramp lowers and the first convoy of trucks rolls onto the floating roadway. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ammunition, fuel barrels, and crates of rations move steadily toward the shore. Soldiers on the beach, weary and hungry, watch in awe as the lifeline of their invasion materializes before them. For days they have fought on sand and fear, unsure if supplies would ever reach them. Now, at last, salvation arrives on a bridge that floats. One British officer turns to his men and says quietly, "Gentlemen, the sea has surrendered." In the days that follow, Port Winston becomes the busiest harbour in the world. From dawn till dusk, Liberty ships queue offshore, their holds packed with tanks, jeeps, and fuel drums. Tugboats weave between them like bees in a hive. On shore, bulldozers roar, carving roads through the dunes. Engineers in oil-stained uniforms dash between the piers, checking cables and pumps. The rhythm of war has found its tempo not in the roar of guns, but in the hum of machinery. Every hour, the harbour delivers its promise. 12,000 tons of cargo flow ashore, daily food for the hungry, bullets for the guns, fuel for the tanks pushing inland toward Caen and beyond. Without it, the invasion would have withered. With it, the Allies now have the means to break through. Yet even as Port Winston thrives, nature reminds them of her power. On June 19th, a massive storm sweeps across the channel. Winds roar at 70 miles per hour, waves crash higher than houses. The American Mulberry at Omaha Beach Mulberry A is shattered beyond repair. But Port Winston endures, its breakwaters hold. Its piers bend and sway, but they do not break. When the storm passes, the British engineers walk its length, exhausted but triumphant. Their harbour still stands. Weeks later, as supplies pour into France and Allied forces advance inland, Winston Churchill visits Arromanches. Standing on the deck of a command ship, he gazes at the floating harbour bearing his name. Trucks still roll across the whale bridges. Cranes still swing in rhythm with the waves. The Prime Minister smiles, eyes glistening. "The sea," he says softly, "has been conquered by the mind of man." In that moment, it is clear Operation Mulberry has turned the tide of history. June 19th, 1944. The day begins with an uneasy stillness. The sea, which had seemed so calm the evening before, now heaves with a strange, restless rhythm. By dawn, the sky turns the colour of slate. Clouds bruise the horizon. A low, mournful wind howls across the English Channel, and with it comes what men will later call the storm of the century. At first, no one believes it will last. Weather officers report rising pressure. Sailors mutter that the worst will pass. But by midday, the waves are climbing, higher and higher, 15 feet, then 20, crashing over the breakwaters with thunderous force. The rain lashes sideways, driven by winds screaming at force 6. For 3 endless days and nights, the channel transforms into a monster, a living thing that hammers and claws at everything mankind has dared to build upon it. Out there, in that fury, the Mulberry harbours, the miracle of steel and concrete, face their trial by storm. Mulberry A, the American harbour, bears the brunt. The Phoenix caissons, those towering concrete sentinels, groan under the weight of the sea. One by one, they begin to crack. Bridges that once bore trucks and tanks now twist like wire. Whale roadways snap apart, and the spud pierheads tear free from their anchors. The men who built them can only watch helplessly as entire sections of the harbour vanish beneath the foaming surf. By the morning of June 22nd, Mulberry A is gone, destroyed. Its ruins lie scattered along the shore, a graveyard of genius and effort. The sea has reclaimed its dominion, but farther east, at Arromanches, Mulberry B Port Winston still stands, barely. The scene is chaos. Waves pound against the breakwaters, cranes sway dangerously, men shout over the roar of wind and water. Yet, amid the destruction, there is movement engineers wading waist-deep in icy surf, torches blazing through sheets of rain. They weld torn steel, tighten cables, replace shattered pontoons. With every spark, with every bolt driven home, they fight back against the sea. This is where the true brilliance of the design reveals itself, modular, repairable, alive. When one section fails, another can be slotted in. When one pierhead collapses, it is replaced within hours. The harbour breathes, bends, adapts, and survives. Within days, Port Winston is operational again. A young lieutenant records in his log, "It should have been wrecked beyond hope, but it endures." Somehow, it endures. Another officer, standing on the breakwater, looks out across the battered but still living harbour and murmurs, "The old man's madness worked after all." The old man, of course, is Churchill, the mind behind this impossible dream. From that day forward, Port Winston becomes the beating heart of the Allied advance. Day and night, Liberty ships queue offshore, waiting for their turn. The great vessels edge forward through the calm created by the bombardment barriers, guided by signal lamps flickering in the dark. Once secured, the unloading begins. Trucks rumble down the floating bridges, their tyres splashing through spray. Crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, boxes of rations, all rolling toward the beaches, toward the men fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy. 12,000 tons, every single day. That number is staggering, enough to feed, fuel, and arm an army of millions. Tanks that will break through Cayenne, gasoline that will carry convoys to Paris, food that will sustain soldiers pushing toward the Rhine. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, every drop of fuel passes through the floating veins of Port Winston. It is no longer just a harbour, it is a living organism, a machine of survival. and like any living thing, it must be tended constantly. Engineers patrol its length with notebooks and wrenches, checking stress gauges, tightening joints, balancing ballast. The tides rise and fall, lifting and lowering the pierheads with a rhythm almost human. The harbour creaks and groans like an old ship but never stops working. One British sergeant, writing home to his wife in Leeds, says it best. "You can walk from England to France now on steel that floats." At night, the harbour glows faintly under the blackout sky. Ships anchored offshore form a shimmering constellation of lights. The sounds never cease, engines rumbling, cranes clanking, waves whispering against the pontoons. The air smells of oil, salt, and something else, hope that the line will hold. By early July, Port Winston handles more traffic than most peacetime ports. Every tide brings in new convoys, new supplies, new lifelines. The German commanders, baffled, cannot understand how the Allies maintain such a relentless flow. Their reconnaissance photos show what appears to be an entire city that wasn't there before, a city that moves with the sea, that breathes with the tide, that refuses to die. And still, the weather threatens. Storms rise and fade, the winds returning to test the harbour again and again. But now, the engineers are ready. They adjust ballast tanks before each squall, anchor the whale bridges deeper, reinforce the Phoenix walls. The lessons learned from the storm of June have forged them into masters of their craft. One American officer remarks, "The Germans had fortresses of concrete. We built fortresses that float." By late summer, the fruits of their labour are undeniable. Over 1 million tons of supplies have passed through Port Winston: weapons, fuel, food, and medical aid. Each ton means a life saved, a victory secured, a step closer to ending the war. And all because, 2 years earlier, someone dared to believe that you could build a harbour that sails. Now, standing on the decks at Arromanches, men can see the future taking shape. Beyond the horizon, France stretches free of the Nazi grip. Columns of smoke rise from battles inland, but the tide of war has turned. The lifeline from England to Normandy holds firm, unbroken. As dusk settles on the channel, a gentle rain begins to fall. The waves lap softly against the Phoenix caissons, their massive silhouettes fading into the mist. A naval chaplain walks along the pier, his coat whipping in the wind, and pauses to look out at the endless water. "It's as if God himself lent us the sea," he whispers. In truth, the sea never gave anything willingly. Every inch of progress was earned through sweat, brilliance, and sacrifice. The men who built the Mulberries didn't just fight nature, they outwitted it. They transformed chaos into order, storm into strength, and impossibility into reality. When historians look back, they will call it one of the greatest engineering achievements of all time. But for the men who lived it, it was something simpler, a job that had to be done, and done right. And so, the battered harbour endures, scarred, patched, but alive. Its steel bones creak beneath the weight of history. Its floating bridges still rise and fall with the tides. And through its veins flows the lifeblood of liberation. Port Winston stands proof that even in the heart of war, amid the rage of the sea, humanity can build something that lasts. Summer of 1944. France awakens from the long shadow of occupation. Across the Normandy countryside, the sounds of artillery fade, replaced by the steady rumble of convoys pushing east. Villages rise from ruins, farmers return to their fields, and at Arromanches, under a sky streaked with gulls and drifting clouds, the harbour that never sleeps continues its endless rhythm. Day and night, Port Winston breathes. Its cranes swing like mechanical giants above the waves, lifting crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel barrels from the holds of Liberty ships. The air smells of oil, salt, and sweat. Men shout across the decks, their voices carried by the wind. Trucks roll down the floating whale roadways, engines sputtering, tires splashing through seawater as they climb onto the French shore. Each movement, each clang of steel on steel, feeds the liberation of a continent. Everything that passes through this harbour, jeeps, tanks, ration tins, radio equipment, prefabricated bridges, and even hospitals on wheels, becomes the blood that keeps the Allied body alive. Without Port Winston, the heart of the invasion would have stopped beating long before it reached Paris. The scale defies imagination. In just 6 months, over 2.5 million men have crossed its trembling bridges, soldiers from Britain, America, Canada, and a dozen other nations united by purpose. 500,000 vehicles thunder across the floating causeways, trucks, tanks, ambulances, artillery pieces, all riding on steel that rises and falls with the tide. And over 4 million tons of supplies, enough to feed and arm armies from Normandy to the Rhine, pass through the harbour's open veins. From above, Allied reconnaissance aircraft capture a vision that no strategist could have fully foreseen. A man-made port sprawling across the French coast, stretching from sea to land like some colossal machine birthed from the imagination of engineers and dreamers. Its breakwaters curve gracefully into the waves, its bridges gleam under the summer sun. Around it, fleets of ships hover in perfect formation, unloading and departing in a rhythm so precise it seems choreographed. The Germans, once confident that geography alone would defend them, now stare in disbelief. Their commanders cannot comprehend how an army has conjured a harbour from the depths of the sea, a harbour larger than many natural ports, yet assembled in mere days. It is a victory not only of might, but of imagination. Even after Cherbourg falls to the Allies, and later Antwerp is captured, Port Winston refuses to rest. It continues to operate tirelessly, not because it must, but because it can. Its design, modular and resilient, defies time and weather alike. The storm that destroyed its twin at Omaha could not claim this one. Every day, its floating piers carry life inland. Every night, its floodlights cut through the darkness like beacons of hope. By autumn, the soldiers begin to call it the harbour that fed an army. It becomes more than a name. It is a legend, whispered in mess halls and foxholes. Pilots flying overhead use it as a landmark, a living monument to human ingenuity. Journalists describe it as a miracle in motion. But to the men who built and maintain it, it is something simpler, proof that the impossible can be done when failure means extinction. In London, when the reports reach the War Office, Winston Churchill listens in silence as the numbers are read aloud. 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, 4 million tons of supplies. He nods once, his cigar unlit, eyes distant. When an aide asks for his reaction, he opens a worn Bible on his desk and reads softly from the book of Habakkuk. "Watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something you would not believe, even if you were told." He smiles faintly. "I told them it could be done," he says, "and by God, it was." For the engineers who once worked by lamplight in secret shipyards along the English coast, this is vindication. Their blueprints, once dismissed as folly, have built the bridge that carried freedom back to Europe. The Phoenix caissons still rise above the waves, scarred and stained by salt, but unbroken. The whale roadways still flex and moan under the weight of trucks. And the spud pierheads, those strange steel creatures that climb with the tide, continue their eternal dance with the sea. By December of 1944, winter tightens its grip on Normandy. The wind cuts sharper, the sea grows colder. The Allied armies have pushed deep into France and Belgium. The front now lies hundreds of miles east, near the Rhine. Port Winston's work, after 6 relentless months, is almost done. Gradually, the convoys lessen, the cranes swing slower, the constant hum of engines begins to fade. One by one, the harbour's great components, those floating fortresses of concrete and steel, are decommissioned. Some are scuttled deliberately, sunk to form new breakwaters. Others are left to the mercy of the tides, their silhouettes dark against the grey water. Gulls circle above them, perching on what was once the lifeline of liberation. The sea, patient as always, begins to reclaim what man had borrowed. Rust spreads like ivy across the steel. The waves lap gently against the sunken caissons, whispering over the edges of history. Yet, even as the physical harbour fades, its spirit remains an artifact of courage and creativity, a testament carved not in stone, but in motion, in tide and time. For decades to come, fishermen will cast their nets among the remnants. Children will dive from the old caissons during summer tides. Tourists will stand on the cliffs above Arromanches and gaze down at the broken shapes in the water, unaware that those silent ruins once fed an army and freed a continent. But for those who remember, the sight will always stir something deeper, because Port Winston was more than an engineering feat. It was a statement that even in the darkest hours of war, human imagination can defy destruction, that vision and courage can make the impossible float. When the history of the Second World War is written, generals and battles will take their place in the spotlight. Yet behind them stands the quiet triumph of the engineers' men who fought not with rifles, but with rulers and rivets. Men who dreamed a harbour into existence and, in doing so, changed the course of the 20th century. As winter turns to spring, the last surviving sections of the Mulberry harbour drift quietly into legend. The tides wash over them with indifference, but the story endures past from soldier to son, from builder to historian. And perhaps, if one listens closely on a calm morning at Arromanches, the echoes remain, the clang of steel, the groan of cables, the low murmur of engines as Liberty ships glide toward the shore, the sound of a harbour that once fed an army and, in its own way, fed the hope of the free world. 20 years have passed. The year is 1964. The war is long over, and the French coast at Arromanches has found its peace again. The wind carries the scent of salt and wildflowers over the cliffs, and the sea glows a soft silver beneath the afternoon sun. Children laugh and build sandcastles where soldiers once bled, their tiny hands shaping towers from the same sands that once drank the blood of men. Their parents lounge nearby, unaware that beneath those gentle waves sleep the bones of an empire that refused to surrender to the sea. The tide rolls in, slow and patient, curling around the remains of concrete giants. The old Phoenix caissons, those floating fortresses of war, lie half-submerged, their massive forms softened by moss and barnacles, their sharp edges worn round by 20 years of tide and salt. To most, they are strange shapes in the surf, weathered and still. But to those who remember, they are more than ruins. They are echoes of an idea that defied the impossible. On a quiet afternoon, an old man stands on the cliff above the Yellowknife Sea. His name is Major Bruce White, once Brigadier Bruce White of the Royal Engineers, the man who drew a line across a map and declared, "This is where Britain will build the road to victory." Now, his back is bent, his hair a cloud of white, his hands trembling slightly as he grips his cane. Yet in his eyes, the same light remains, that fierce, unyielding spark that once faced storms and deadlines and doubt. He watches the tide move in and out, as if the sea itself were breathing. Below, the waves shimmer around the remnants of the Mulberry harbour, the skeletal frames of the Phoenix caissons, the rusting ribs of the whale bridges, the silent ghosts of the spud pierheads. Time has turned them from machines of war into monuments of peace. Seagulls perch upon them like sentinels. The horizon stretches wide and blue, indifferent yet eternal. A young tourist, a boy of perhaps 12, notices the old man staring out to sea. He walks over, curiosity bright in his eyes. "Monsieur," he asks in halting English, pointing toward the grey shapes in the water, "what are those things out there?" Bruce White turns to him, smiling softly. "Those," he says, his voice low and steady, "are the reason you can ask me that question in peace." The boy frowns, unsure, but nods politely before running off to join his friends. White watches him go, a small laugh escaping his lips, the sound of a man who has carried the weight of history and found, at last, the grace of understanding. He closes his eyes, and the years begin to blur. The sound of the waves fades, replaced by the distant clang of hammers in English shipyards, the echo of labour that began under secrecy and fear. He can almost smell the grease and sweat, hear the barked orders of foremen, the grind of steel against steel as welders forged the first sections of what would become the Mulberries. Then, another sound, the roar of tugs pulling mountains through the storm. He remembers that night, in June of 1944, when the sea raged and men refused to yield. The dark shapes of the Phoenix caissons dragged through black waters, navigation lights glowing like stars upon a restless sea, voices shouting through megaphones, engines straining, waves smashing against steel. "Easy does it, lads, that's Churchill's harbour you're towing." And beyond that, another memory, the thunder of boots on the whale bridges, the endless procession of men and machines rolling toward freedom, the rumble of engines, the crack of chains, the laughter of soldiers who, for the first time, believed they might actually win. It all lives there, beneath the tide, the sound, the movement, the heartbeat of something larger than any one man. Bruce White opens his eyes again. The sea has not changed. It still breathes, still whispers its old songs, still carries the weight of those who never came home. The same sea that once threatened to swallow their work now guards their memory. Its waves wash gently over the ruins, not as an enemy but as a keeper of secrets. He knows that somewhere beneath that water lie names he once knew: engineers, sailors, welders, soldiers, men who laboured in silence, who built cathedrals that floated. They did not fight with rifles or bayonets, but with blueprints and courage. Their battlefield was the tide, their enemy was time, and against both they prevailed. The Mulberries sleep now, but not as relics of destruction. They rest as monuments to human ingenuity, to the stubborn belief that the impossible is only an idea waiting for a plan. The sea has not erased them, it has merely claimed them as part of itself, a testament written in salt and stone. Bruce White breathes deeply, tasting the wind, the salt, and something more: memory. Around him, the world has moved on. France is free, Europe is rebuilt, children laugh where cannons once thundered. The harbour that fed an army has become a reef, a sanctuary for fish and seabirds, a home for life instead of death. He takes a step forward, leaning heavily on his cane, and looks once more at the horizon. The sunlight dances upon the waves, turning the water into sheets of silver and gold. For a fleeting moment, he imagines the harbour as it was alive, gleaming, filled with ships and shouting men. And then, as the sun dips lower, the reflection shifts, and the water itself seems to become steel again, shimmering with the ghosts of bridges and cranes and the silhouettes of liberty ships waiting offshore. For one heartbeat, it is all there, the living memory of an impossible dream. Then it fades, swallowed by the dusk. He turns to leave, but pauses one last time. "We built it," he murmurs to himself. And it held. His voice is carried away by the wind, mingling with the cries of gulls and the soft sighing of the tide. As he walks back along the cliff path, the sky deepens into violet. Below, the sea continues its eternal motion, rising and falling over the bones of history. Beneath the tide, the Mulberries sleep not as ruins, but as reminders. They are the proof that courage can be crafted from steel, that imagination can build bridges even across oceans, and that from the wreckage of war, something miraculous can rise. When night falls, the lights of Arromanches twinkle along the shore. The waves shimmer faintly beneath the moonlight, and for those who know how to look, they still carry reflections of another time when men turned dreams into harbours and harbours into hope. As the tide rolls in, washing softly against the remnants of Port Winston, the past and the present meet in silence. The war is gone, but its echoes remain in the wind, in the water, and in the hearts of those who remember what was built here. And as the final light of sunset fades into the sea, the waves catch the glow for one last moment. They shimmer like moving steel, glimmering with the ghosts of that impossible harbour that once fed an army and changed the fate of the world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.